Right. Ram. Bam. There we go. How was the book a day? I overslept. By a ton. 4 hours to be exact. But I think I'll be okay. We'll do a long stream today, and then we'll do a longer stream tomorrow.
Did someone boot the backers snooze snoot?
It was you, wasn't it, Lahan? It was you. It was you. I think we are gonna react, because we're still gonna be able to have like a 7-8 hour stream. So let us figure out this react. Let's do the fantasy Warhammer, because people always told me that that's probably the one I'm gonna like the most. We'll do that one. It's by Pancreas! Yay! Let's get some Pancreas in here.
It's always a joy to have more people to play with and interact with in the hobby space. It's a new chance for me to try and convert someone, anyone, into accepting that the Eldar are actually really cool and interesting, and please, just for 5 minutes, stop saying elf bad. But speaking of elves, every time there's a wave of people that first learn about Warhammer, there's always one thing in common with them. None of them realize there's more to Warhammer than Space Marines, Tyranids, and spikier Space Marines. There's a whole other pair of settings that also exist, and they just fly right under the radar half the time. And this sucks, because the best Warhammer setting is right there.
PancreasNoWork, my
GW
beloved
ended
elf
it, but then it came
propagandist.
back. And if you don't want to, you don't even have to collect thousands of dollars of minis to play with this one. Kind of. Warhammer Fantasy has been around longer than even 40k. It's had its ups, it's had its downs, it got blown up for a little bit, but thanks to Total War, Vermintide, and the constant nagging of the community, you can once again play in the old world. With elves, dwarves, and humans as standard, but also some more out there races, such as magical frogs, rats, and Walmart shoppers. And not enough people know about it. Not nearly enough. And not nearly enough people learn that this setting is even a thing. So I'm gonna be doing my part today. Today I'm gonna learn you all about every faction in Warhammer Fantasy. Some of them had extensive army lists and plot relevance, some of them languished when unupdated army books for years on end, and some of them until recently were relegated to about 3 pages of background lore. Doesn't matter, we're doing it all. If you can conceivably consider it an actual faction, they'll be here. Think of it as a companion to this video.
They're all here. Ba-da-ba-ba!
That one was me trying to overview the setting as a whole, and this one is about the groups of people in the setting. So let's dive into a world of fantasy and see what all that nonsense about them having the Warhammer is all about. But you're about to start listening to me list off all kinds of factions. And do you know what you could be listening to me with? Raycon and their Everyday Earbuds, the sponsor of this video.
I do wish I had some
earbuds are some of the finest available on the market.
I don't know where my earbuds are. They're somewhere in my room.
Let's just get right into the features of these bad boys. Multi-point connectivity, so if you and someone else want to share the music,
off-brand
you can
though,
with
so they're
no
not exactly
problems.
the best.
Active noise cancellation, because sometimes the outside world
They
just
were
needs to take a
nice,
step
and
back
I
for a
liked
bit. And a
them.
new sleek ergonomic design to make them look and feel better than ever
No,
before.
I'm sad I can't find
It's
them.
even got a cool protective case to keep ripping. They're already half the price of other brands, and with my link,
Does his pancreas not work? Is that why his name is PancreasNoWork?
you can get them at an even better price. Spice
A
up
wee
how you
bit
listen to
more
music,
volume.
podcasts, and more with Raycon's Everyday Earbuds. Now then, let's talk about where it all began. That's orc spelled with a C, by the way, not a K. But across the board, the greenskins of Warhammer Fantasy aren't that different from the ones in 40k, which is why we're starting with them. They like to fight, they're mushroom people, they're green. If you took an orc from 40k and put him in a greenskin tribe in Fantasy, he probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference. Might wonder why no one has a decent shooter hanging around, but he'd be content with his life regardless. He might even be happier, because these orcs have characters like Grimgor instead of Ghazghkull. There are no thinking and tactics for Grimgor, only beating everything near him to death. The greenskins used to have some pretty different lore, being closer to D&D than anything else. They had half-orcs and they didn't reproduce with mushroom spores. Then as time went on, that was moved away from, and eventually we came to where we are now in the old world. That being that the orcs hopped a ride with the old ones' ships when they came to the Warhammer Fantasy world. More on them later. From there, they naturally began spreading out across the entire world. The old ones and their servants did their best to get rid of the orcs, as they did all other races they weren't quite fond of, but you can't get rid of the orcs once they're on a planet. It's just not possible. So nowadays, if you wander around a given area long enough, chances are you'll find some greenskins kicking about, making things worse for whoever lives there. The orcs themselves are one of the biggest similarities between the two settings. The biggest guy is in charge of the tribe, and if you get a real big boss, he might be in charge of multiple tribes. And when you get a really big boss, you can get a whole proper WoW going. When this happens, you usually get a whole lot of dead humans and dwarfs. Painting something red still makes it go faster, painting it blue makes it luckier, and can block arrows from killing the blue painted orc. And they still
Why is he painted blue and no one else is painted blue? Does he want to be different?
He'll love looting. Not nearly as much as in 40k, but you can always find an orc in a tribe wearing dwarf plate armor or wielding a human greatsword he grabbed off a corpse. They do have some more savage brethren who judge other orcs for using things like basic tools or digging a pit to shit in rather than just letting it drop where you stand, but aside from being a bit more magical, those orcs aren't really all that different. Where you get the biggest change though is with the goblins. See, in 40k, grots are an entire species of plot irrelevance to the orcs. You'll get one like Makari once in a blue moon who are allowed to be in the shadow of the spotlight of a far more famous orc, but the goblins in fantasy are an actual threat all by themselves. Sure, they're still cowardly and will refuse a stand-up fight unless they outnumber the enemy 40-1. Sure, they're still kicked around by the orcs and are used to do all the manual construction stuff. And sure, they're still slightly smarter than the orcs, so anything resembling any actual construction or research is done by them. But every now and then, not often, but every now and then, you get a goblin who's a cut above the rest. And when that happens, everyone's in trouble. The goblins are cunning little buggers. They know in a straight-up fight they're gonna lose, so they'll wait till the biggest
Now they just need to add kobolds so you guys can get in there.
orc around is sleeping and slit his throat, or poison his food, or convince him there's something shiny in a nearby cave filled with hungry trolls. And sometimes, if they're really insane, they'll overdose on literally magic mushrooms, and when they come back to reality, they've slaughtered every orc in charge in a manic frenzy. Now instead of a big green moron who just about knows which way is forward leading the army, you have someone like Skarsnik leading an orc army. A green little Sun Tzu who's gonna run circles around you and your entire military. Or you can get one that pretty much just lucks into the position, like Grom the Paunch, hallowed be his girth. Instead of being clever, he just got incredibly lucky and was forced to eat troll meat. Instead of exploding, which is normally what happens when you do that, he just kept growing alongside it. 3 things happened. 1, he got so incredibly fat he'd beat rival orcs by sitting on them. 2, he became a legend among goblins everywhere, the alpha male fantasy they all wish they could be. And 3, he nearly ended the world by sailing from the equivalent of the Middle East or Africa to the middle of the Atlantic and destabilizing the High Elves. If you like grots but wish they could, do anything important ever, maybe take a look at the goblins. Their history really isn't anything special though, mostly because they're greenskins and what you see is what you get. Usually, they beat each other up. Every now and again, one of them beats up enough orcs that he convinces them all to go beat someone else up instead. This continues until that war boss is killed, and then the orcs disband and go back to beating each other up again. Some evil dwarfs like to use them as slaves, and when they tried to make bigger, stronger, and smarter orcs to use as slaves, they immediately learned why that was a bad idea when the orcs revolted. If you like being mean and green, you'll like the orcs. And one crucial thing I nearly forgot, they love to dance. Wurzag may be the prophet of the orc gods first, but he's a hell of a dancer second. Now let's get out of the realm of similarities.
Ooh, he breaking it down.
Into some things fantasy really does different.
Breaking it down, guys.
When the old ones showed up, the planet they arrived on was ideal for creating the ultimate weapon to fight chaos. Of course, they still had to create it. So to do that, they started by moving the planet closer to the sun to warm it up, which pissed off a lot of things on it, like the dragons. Speaking of, there were a lot of races on the planet that wouldn't really like to share the room with the old ones' creations. So to help them with the legwork, as well as get rid of all those fellas, the old ones created the lizardmen. They also created most of the other playable races in the setting, so unless otherwise stated, assume all these factions started out as the test tube babies of the old ones in one way or another. The lizardmen were not this ultimate weapon against chaos, although they were still pretty good at fighting. You know how I said the orcs resisted extermination by the old ones? That was just them who managed it. Everyone else fell under a tide of angry lizards, dinosaurs, or angry lizards riding dinosaurs. With that small...
Okay, so... orcs only survived because of orcs. Everyone else had to deal with lizardmen.
Little bit of genociding out of the way, the old ones set about making the world fit their needs. The lizardmen were their chief assistants, and to be the best secretaries they could possibly be, the old ones made them in several different flavors. All of them with a dash of Mesoamerican cultures thrown in, because if you have the option to have Aztec lizard-riding dinosaurs, you have no good reason not to take it. First you have the Slan. The Slan are the best wizards in all the world. They may be big fat
I was about to say, is he gonna mention how big that guy is?
Code people, but the first generation ones were the ones who changed the entire planet's orbit, moving around where it needed to be in space. Moving down the generational line, they did get weaker, but that's highly relative. Second generation Slan could only cause entire mountain ranges to suddenly appear at the drop of a hat. These were the lizardmen who directly worked with the old ones, and delivered their messages and will to the rest of them. Next you have the Saurus. Stupid people might think that since the Lizardmen are a Bronze Age civilization at best, they're not much of a threat. Then an 8-foot-tall monster from the Cretaceous period clubs you to death with an obsidian axe, and you find out just how the Saurus were able to depopulate an entire planet. These were the generals of the Lizardmen armies. They were bred for war and only war. They're pretty straightforward, and all their characters have the same background of bred to kick ass, but this is Warhammer. That's a feature, not a bug, and they break it down to its simplest possible form. Next are
If I remember correctly, that's basically the Aztecs in some of the Age of Empire games. Their best stuff is probably in the bronze, but it does not mean that they're not strong.
the skinks. They're little chibi gecko axolotl things that do to the day-to-day management of Lizardman society. You need a building planned out or to do basic diplomacy, you send the skinks. They're also skirmishers. When the trees start speaking great planese, it's the skinks doing it. They've even got their own god all to themselves, Sotek. It was a bit of a controversy when he came around
You
at
can come
first,
in
but
my
the rest
room,
of the
Ari.
Lizardmen seemed content enough to let him be worshipped. Finally, we have the Croxagores. They're alligator men. They build the buildings and gator death roll all over enemy armies. That's it, but that's all they need to do.
The
When
Gator
Chaos
Men.
first came in the
Hello?
enough to let him be worshipped. Finally, we have
Gator Men. Nom, 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 nom. Nom, 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 nom. Yes, I like them.
the Croxagores. They're alligator men. They build the buildings and gator death roll all over enemy armies.
No. Only one argument needed for the lizard men, gator men. Hey, bro. Hello, spider. Welcome to stream.
Armies. That's it, but that's all they need to do. When Chaos first came and the Old Ones fled, the Lizardmen had to figure out how to not only survive, but continue the Old Ones' work in their absence, which they kind of, sort of have been pulling off a little bit. They held off the invasion at the cost of almost
Hello?
all the first Slan and most of their spawning pools, turning them into a very
Yes,
numerically
sir?
disadvantaged race. Not that this stops them from still sometimes rampaging across the world, but they are largely held up in the jungles of Lustria nowadays, also known as South America, because Warhammer Fantasy is just Earth if someone with really shaky hands drew a map of it. They're isolationists, the Slan will spend centuries at a time meditating on the few plaques the old ones have left, and they really hate when tourists come to Lustria because it's usually to steal those plaques. They're all gold, you see, because gold doesn't tarnish or rust. Convenient for writing things down in a jungle, less convenient when all the warm bloods come to steal the shiny stuff. If you see a Lizardman army, you're either screwed because the Great Plan dictates your death, or screwed because you're somewhere they don't think you should be. Very simple faction, but again, that's a positive. Sometimes being dino-brained is the way to go.
Go ahead,
Also
Ari.
known as the Imperium, but not as awful. These guys are the default protagonist faction. They're the strongest nation of men in the world, and that's no meaningless boast here, because there's actual competition they have in that department, unlike the Imperium. They formed about 2,500 years prior to the setting's modern day, when a pretty cool dude named Sigmar was born. Sigmar had a dream, uniting the scattered tribes of barbarian into one unified nation of mankind, to drive back the darkness and bring peace to the land. He did this chiefly by beating up everyone who disagreed with him, but in fairness, most of them deserved it. If this sounds familiar, let me just remind you that this guy was here first. Plus, Sigmar realized that outright killing everyone just because they disagree with you is perhaps a bad idea that will lead to problems later down the line, so he settled for only beating them up. Sigmar didn't just beat up people, though. He also beat up a lot of orcs. Like, a whole lot of orcs. So many orcs that the dwarfs swore eternal friendship with mankind, because if Sigmar is so kick-ass, surely the rest of humanity can't be that bad either. He united most of the tribes of man in the area, and you better believe I'll come back to the most later, and formed the Empire of Man. 50 years later, he just up and left. A little bit after that, he became a god, and the Empire soon worshipped Sigmar as the chief god of their pantheon. The Empire is pretty unique as far as fantasy factions
He
go.
became a god.
Usually a fantasy setting will reach the medieval era, and then very explicitly never move past that for the next trillion years of its history. The Empire isn't like that. When Sigmar was doing his thing, it was barely the Iron Age. The dwarfs giving them steel
dear.
weapons every now and then was considered the height of technological advancement. Nowadays,
I hope that didn't
2,500
affect
years later,
anything.
the Empire has tanks. Good tanks? Yeah. Look, for a Renaissance age civilization, tanks are pretty damn impressive no matter how good they actually are.
There we go.
They have factories, mechanical horses, and countless other things that make you wonder if the book you're reading was put in the fantasy section by mistake. They also have wizards who scam people out of $50 for the thrill of it, politicians who constantly need to be wrangled by the one competent guy in the entire government, and enough floppy hats to arm the entire Holy Roman Empire with. They're still normal people, though. The three things that make the Empire great aren't genetically modified super soldiers, wars or lost technological
Griffin!
secrets from a golden age.
Griffin. Wait, so they're wingless Griffin? That doesn't make any sense.
Or even the direct intervention of their gods. It's faith, steel, and gunpowder.
It's a weird
whole lot of
creation.
each.
It
Give
just
a man a
looks
halberd,
weird.
a cause to fight for, and his friends by his side, and it turns out you can push back even the most determined of evil murder Vikings time and time again. Most Warhammer fantasy books follow the Imperial characters around, and you get a good feel for just how fleshed out this land is through them. You've got the Heartlands, sure, places like Altdorf where it's interconnected with the wider world, magic runs through the very city through its colleges of magic, and elves and dwarves can be seen regularly. Then you have backwater shitholes like Ostermark, where the people are outnumbered by everything nearby that wants to kill them, and guns are still a scary black magic invention for a good half the population. Or Averland, whose most noticeable trait is that they hunt halflings for sport there. There's halflings in the Empire, by the way. They can vote on the next emperor because they baked a previous one a really good meal. They also had a civil war over pie. Don't be a halfling in Averland. You're gonna decorate someone's mantelpiece sooner or later. Of course, this is still Warhammer, fantasy or not. Sure, I said it's not as awful as the Imperium, but it still has witch hunters who will burn you alive for being a wizard, or being a mutant, or just for being a bit too ugly, because that's also a sign of chaos mutation. And it's still a Renaissance age civilization.
Of course, they'd have witch
people,
hunters.
This means it's a medieval civilization, but you might see more pretty statues and paintings than your ancestors did. You're still probably gonna die of the water making you poop too much. They're bordered by the undead, beastmen are everywhere once you leave the city limits, and worst of all, they have people who have sex with horses for neighbors. The Empire is constantly on the defense. From orcs, from chaos, from beastmen, which are a different kind of chaos, and really anyone else who's feeling a bit bored that day. But the average citizen of the Empire will do their part to keep the hordes at bay, and at the end of the day, they did this for 2,500 years until the authors decided reality itself had to go, which is a pretty good track record. They're a human, relatable nation, like if the Imperial Guard got to actually be the main characters of 40k instead of Space Marine 9001, model on sale now for $60. It's grounded, with people having normal struggles, but also fantastical, with wizards and monsters being everywhere. They do have one ultimate ace in the hole, though, the reigning emperor, Karl Franz. The best statesman in the old world, the guy who wields the Warhammer. You know the one, the actual real-life Warhammer logo? That's his, and he's very good at using it. He's the kind of politician who could convince you into giving him everything you own and leave you thinking you got the better deal, but also the kind of person who wouldn't do that to you. He's got everyone's interest at heart, and overall, this guy's the best emperor in Warhammer. Not Warhammer Fantasy, Warhammer in general. Kiss my ass, corpse worshippers. This one can walk, talk, and beat you to death in the name of the Empire.
Kiss my Alrighty then!
If you like relatable folk with a touch of the fantastic, Sigmar and his people have your back. But I did say most tribes are united by Sigmar. Unfortunately, a couple weren't able to be integrated for one reason or another. Let's talk about the one that I like first.
Ooh! I like this one already. They have hussars, and they ride bears.
Kislev is all of Eastern Europe thrown into a pot and mixed to boiling until it coagulated into one Slavic specialty stew. They live in a frozen hellhole, which is also their country's greatest defense. They wear thick fur pelts. They have winged hussars. They also squat in the middle of a battlefield, because such is the natural state of the Kislevite. And vodka. Even the dwarfs and their genetically ingrained alcoholism respect the drinking skills of a Kislevite. Kislev's job in the setting is to face tank chaos invasions before they get to the Empire of Man, which they do pretty well. Half their cities are torn down in the process, but they're a hardy bunch. They walk into the winter snow, and when everyone occupying their land freezes to death, come back in and rebuild. Their religion is different from the Empire's and they view them as weak southerners, but the two nations are still staunch allies. Mostly because when the forces of actual hell are your neighbors, anyone else is going to be a good friend. They're led by the Tsar or Tsarina of Kislev, because GW was worried you wouldn't understand which region this place is based off of. Many times, and indeed the last one before the world blew up, this was an ice witch, a handy person to have running your country when a raging blizzard is considered a mild day. You still can't play as Kislev in the old world, thank you GW for that extreme blue balling, but they had some pretty heavy redesigns, and a lot of the marketing for the old world did at one point feature Kislev. Here's hoping GW realizes that winged hussars riding bears is something people are interested in.
I mean, seriously.
Shame that sentence needs to be said. I don't know why anyone would ever need to be told that. Blat.
Hi,
These are
welcome
those people
stream.
who have sex with horses. When
It's not wrong. Polar bears and winged hussars?
Kumar was uniting everyone, they refused to join him, because obviously they were too good to join him. Did they have some super special magical secret, or a technology that could let them surpass the fledgling empire, or some other race in the whole? No, but they...
Why is that guy... Why does he have paper on his horse? What is that supposed to do?
They were too good to join him. Did they have some super special magical secret, or a technology that could let them surpass the fledgling empire, or some other race in the whole? No, but they copied the elves' homework and our French, so they decided they were too good to shack up with a future god and went it alone. Bretonia looked at all the cool advancements the empire was making, how it was a dynamic nation in a genre that usually gets to the medieval era and then freezes like it's going into cryo-sleep, and said no. We will not be doing that. We will be staying as medieval land. It is mandated by the government that technology will not advance, that society will never have any major upheavals, and that everything is just perfect the way it is. It's like that old decree the Pope made that declared crossbows were a blasphemous weapon, taken to be an entire society's philosophy. Bretonia is all about knights. Baby knights proving themselves, magical knights defending the...
That knight looks awesome. It's official. Those are my knights.
realm and saving damsels, knights leading the country, the further the goals and interests of the rest of the knights. Imagine King Arthur. That's it. Just imagine King Arthur stretched out to be a whole faction. The in-universe justification is that they saw high elf cavalry and just ran with the concept. Out of universe, it's just King Arthur and every medieval stereotype thrown together. You could, admittedly, say the same thing about the Empire and the Holy Roman Empire, or Kislev in Eastern Europe, but those are eras and places fantasy writers don't usually copy wholesale, so they get a pass from me. Bretonia is the land of almost every fantasy setting ever conceived since Lord of the Rings, and it shows. Unfortunately, they can afford to do all of this fantasy stasis, because an elf goddess is playing them like a fiddle. Their precious Lady of the Lake, also known as the elf goddess of magic, chooses some super special knights to become Grail Knights. They sip from her chalice of bathwater, and when the now Grail Knight emerges, they're like supercharged D&D paladins. Bullets are an inconvenience, their armor is magically toughened, and their mounts never tire, so until the Empire invents the Gatling gun, they're able to keep being aggressive backwater dickweeds. In older lore they were tolerable, but in modern lore someone must have felt they weren't angsty enough and made them nice and extra oppressive. The peasants are honored if the noble allows them to have 3 pennies a week instead of 2, ladies who aren't magical are property because medieval times, and social mobility is a punchline. I hope you like medieval medicine. The Empire's medicine already isn't that great. Bretonian medicine is the kind of thing that has a 300% fatality rate. And horses. Everyone has a horse. Even the lowliest peasants have a horse that more often than not eats and lives better than they do. I like horses, but I don't like them that much. If you've ever been to medieval times and made that your entire personality, Bretonia's a good faction for you. Because God is real and hates me, they're also one of the starter factions of the old world, so getting into Warhammer Fantasy nowadays is pound for pound fairly easily done with Bretonia. In all honesty, pick them if you like them. It is on some level cool, because for as much shit as I was giving them for
I like horses, like the horses alone.
being generic and bland knights, knights are cool. There's a reason every 5-year-old wants to be a knight and not a Landsknecht. I mean, for God's sake.
Hey, I like knights. I like knights. You leave knights alone. Knights are cool.
Sakes, just trying to say that word is difficult. The other army GW has refused to put onto the tabletop despite already having a direct hand in reworking them for Total War. Did you know there's a fully fleshed out Cathayan army book for GW developed? You can't have it because funds not allowed. This is a shame because Cathay is awesome. Dragons are also awesome. Cathay agrees because they're ruled by immortal dragons who the Cathayans follow at every whim. Fantasy China is a magical place and one of the few places in the entire planet that might not be a terrible one to live in. Every now and again it does what actual China used to do and implodes, and sure, those ruling dragons get along like all siblings do, i.e. barely at all, but in day-to-day life, not a bad place. And it always comes back together after imploding, usually after Mommy and Daddy Dragon come back to kick everyone's heads in till they start behaving again. It is, like I said, just fantasy medieval China.
That's a big boy. That's a big boy.
I know, but that is a compliment. You know those terracotta soldiers? What if they were animated by magic and also 100 feet tall? Are you a 40K fan? Imagine if the Primarchs weren't utter morons and failures almost to a man. because that's Cathay. Again, for reasons I will never understand, we don't have them yet in tabletop. But Total War does, and by God is it fun to play as Cathay. The Silk Road was prosperous in real life, and it's prosperous in Warhammer, so if/when they finally come out, prepare to show the world why China was for a good 1,000 years the most prosperous country on the planet. It's even better here because this Great Wall has magical dragon ladies guarding it. Oh, Cathay is also near the countries of Nippon, Ind, and Koresh. Nippon is Japan, Ind is India, and Koresh is Southeast Asia. I'm not giving them their own spots because no one cares about them, and I can't bring myself to either. That's it for the non-chaotic living humans, but that doesn't mean we're done talking about humans. The next few ones just don't have a heartbeat. Or skin. These are the bad guys when chaos has taken a break. Imagine Dracula, if you will. Now imagine Dracula if he had a 100,000 strong army of zombies, skeletons, lesser vampires, and pretty much anything else that you could find at a Spirit Halloween. The total history of the vampire stretches back thousands of years, but for the purposes of this video, we're only going to go back a few hundred. We go to a fella named Vlad von Karstein, because if you haven't caught on yet, this setting is allergic to subtlety. He showed up to the very on-the-nose Empire province of Sylvania, which was a horrible place to live. It was
Those are faces! Why are there faces in the book? Alrighty then.
Swamps,
faces in
the
the
people
ground.
were dumb and afraid of scary monsters, and because this setting is what it is, they weren't even wrong to be so. When a peasant in real life says the witch made their family ill with the plague, it's baseless superstition. When a peasant in Warhammer says that, there's a good chance they're right. When a Sylvanian peasant says that, they are right. Vlad showed—
They are right! There's a good chance, and then these people, they are right. Which made you crazy? Is that a bat werewolf? That's gotta be badass. Bat werewolves. Well then.
Goes up to this province, marries the daughter of the ruling noble to become its next ruler, and despite being a blood-sucking vampire, this place sucked so hard it was a marked improvement. Even better, him and his wife Isabella actually loved each other. They had vampire kids like Conrad von Karstein, who was insane and liked to twist the heads off of peasants, and Manfred von Karstein, who was the worst. Of course, this wouldn't be Warhammer.
Who is the worst? As opposed to twisting the heads off of random people.
Or if everyone was just nice and peaceful, so one day Vlad had a—
That's a bat? Werewolf dragon? Hello?
brilliant idea. What if he was the—
No, wait, that would be a drake. It's too small to be a dragon. But, like, hello?
the Emperor. He could live forever and usher in an eternal age of prosperity, mostly for vampires, but for some of the people too. So he tried to become the Emperor. At gunpoint. Zombie point more like, but 100,000 zombies is a lot more effective than most Renaissance age guns were. He failed, but the damage was done. Him, his wife, and their children spread vampirism across the Empire. Now Sylvania is barely even considered a part of it, and everyone does their best to ignore it. This is probably a bad move, because every few decades some vampire likes to try their hand at raising a massive undead army to take over the Empire with. They all fail, but they're very murderous. Them failing means the Empire's population only drops by 20% instead of 100%. Just watch the first episode of Castlevania if you somehow haven't, for what it's like when the Midnight Aristocracy goes to war. There's a lot of vampires to choose from, though, to get your specific undead needs satisfied. The von Karsteins are the classic vampires, who want to suck your blood and rule over the night.
Blood Dragon!
Lions are a vampire KGB, with spy networks in pretty much every place on the planet. Except Lustria, probably.
Blood Dragon.
Blizzards don't take kindly to that sort of thing. The Strigoi are what happens if your average Florida resident became a vampire, the Necros are evil wizards, and the Blood Dragons are a heavy metal album cover. If you thought it was kick-ass when Dracula sent the forces of hell to wreak havoc on the living, you'll love the vampire counts. But I did mention that some of the undead don't have skin, and vampires usually have that at least. For those fellas, we need to go further south.
Of course, further south.
Ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt.
Ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt. Why is there a Anubis skeleton? That just feels like they're... That feels like they're trying too hard. Just making an Anubis.
You now understand the basics of the Tomb Kings. Once upon a time, thousands of years in the past, the lands of Nehekara were prosperous. They had regular contact with their gods, magical constructs to defend themselves with, and when they had a good king like Setra, they would sometimes go on to conquer half the world. Then a fella named Nagash was born. He's awful. This man was a monster through and through. He's really
He's bald, so it makes sense.
Smart, though. Smart enough to capture dark elves and force them to teach him dark magic, which usually humans can't do. Smart enough to invent necromancy with what he learned. Smart enough to overthrow his brother, the king, and take over most of the land with his undead forces. And he's also quite powerful with his magic. He was eventually overthrown and cast into the desert where he died, but he invented necromancy. Death is a suggestion for him. Such is his power. When he inevitably came back, he discovered someone had stolen his research notes and used them to make vampires. He made those vampires his generals, and no, they didn't have a choice in the matter, and then decided ruling just Nehekara with undead wasn't enough. So he formed a plan to kill everyone in the region at once, resurrect every corpse on the planet, and take over the world with his World War Z undead army.
Sounds about right.
Part 1 of the plan went off without a hitch. It was only through the intervention of
Don't quote that! Both doesn't equal evil!
the Skaven, who I promise you will love, and the last living dude in the region, which kept most of Part 2 from happening. Then everyone in Nehekara promptly stood back up, realized their hearts were no longer beating but they were still standing, and things got messy. Imagine Game of Thrones before it became horrible, with all the political fighting over who gets to be king. Now imagine
All the political fighting. Why do you have... Is that a... Okay, I get the scorpions, but... The hell is that? Is that a skeleton? Is that a dinosaur? Are those vultures? Okay then.
of Thrones if every single person who was ever the rightful king was now alive at the same time fighting over what was their throne. Not they believed it to
So
be their
ginger
throne,
equals maid
or
and
they
bald
wanted it
equals
to be
evil.
their...
No.
So being a ginger and bald makes you a evil maid?
No, stop. No! Don't quote it. Don't
throne.
quote it.
It was the throne they sat on once upon a time. And also they can respawn. And also, most common people were mindless undead skeletons who had the flesh flayed from their bones with the
He looks like he has a deformed face.
desert winds and could only follow basic orders,
He has
like
no butt.
kill that guy who thinks he's the real king. This does not a stable nation make. Luckily, the priest woke up that Cetra guy, who cockslapped everyone until they started behaving again. Now the Tomb Kings no longer have skin, have no clear path to achieve immortal bodies to feel with again that they so crave, and no longer have the backing of their very gods. Fortunately for them, death is more of a suggestion. They can still use magic, even if not quite as good as it was when the gods were helping, and they now have eternity to do whatever they want, as long as it doesn't involve some sort of physical sensation. Sometimes they still fight amongst each other, sometimes they spend their newfound immortality pursuing whatever hobbies they want, and sometimes they sail all the way from Egypt to Sweden and burn half of it to the ground because someone stole their hat. And on the rare...
Someone stole their hat. Because they're bald, they need their hat.
rarest of occasions, a tomb queen will tell a strapping young lad that if they still had functional genitals, she'd fuck him so hard the experience would kill him. They're very fun. They're true neutral
Alrighty then. Ooh, snake people. I bet you they're fun to
to the
fight.
core. Some of them want conquest, some of them just want to find new hobbies, some hate the living out of jealousy, some don't care either way as long as they serve, and some go out of their way to find human members to recruit for their court because it reminds them of what they've lost. If you can think of a motivation, there's a Tomb King that has it. It's a very simple thing to know if the Tomb Kings are for you or not. Do you like the Mummy? Do you like ancient Egypt? Have you ever wondered what it'd be like if the Sphinx came to life and started crushing people like Godzilla? Tomb Kings are perfect for you then. And hey, look at that. They're the other starter faction for the old world. Now you can get into fantasy proper without people like me dismissively calling you a horse molester. So now we can leave this region of the world and indeed humanity, and I have forgotten 4 human nations that deserve at least a little bit of credit. Shit.
Alright. I think we will leave the other half of this for next time. That was a good react. I liked some of that stuff. So far, I like the medieval guy, the medieval China, and I like the vampire dragon guys. Those are my favorites so far. They look cool. Quite cool.